You've heard a lot of specifics. Bill and I are bond attorneys. Sorry.
No, we still are. We were and still are bond attorneys in the two law firms in the state that represent the cities, counties, schools, and the state when they're borrowing money and issuing basically tax-exempt bonds. You've heard, we've heard lots of specifics, and what I want to do in maybe 2 minutes is give you two generic subjects that cover all cities, all schools, all counties when they're issuing bonds. The predominant method for issuing bonds for projects is called a general obligation bond. It's a bond that basically pledges full faith and credit of that issuer. Those types of bonds are paid from a debt service levy. A levy that's part of a budget that is separate from the general fund. There is no statutory limit on that debt service levy, but it is levied for the only purpose of paying off general obligation debt. General obligation debt, as we know it, is structured so that payments are made every year. The payments are set. We know exactly, the issuer knows exactly what they're going to have to pay for. It can be as long as 20 years. So when you look at the total valuation that's available to an issuer and find out that some portion, commercial or industrial, is going to be reduced or taken away, but the amount that's needed to be collected is the same, the only option they have is to raise the debt service levy against the remaining valuation, which is all residential. That's the point. I think that there have been a lot of commentaries about tax shifts, principally on the residential property, particularly with respect to general obligation debt, the ability to pay it, and the need to generate the same amount of money regardless of how much value is there. It's going to be a shift to more levy against residential property. Another type of debt that we have is tax increment debt. And tax increment debt is not a full faith and credit debt of an issuer. It's payable for the most part on its face from incremental revenues, often produced from specific properties, but sometimes from a larger urban renewal area. A little different problem with that type of debt, if in fact valuations are reduced. The city has made no obligation to levy anything to pay off that pure tax increment revenue debt. It has made a pledge, however, much on the order of a mortgage, of these specific tax increment revenues, whatever they are and whenever they come in. So a lender knows, this is my security for this bond issue. If those valuations go down and if the TIF revenue is less than is needed to make payments, the city's not under an obligation to make that up anywhere and probably won't and can't. So in this circumstance, you have not necessarily residents or cities involved with the problem. You have potential lenders who wind up with a piece of paper that they can look at and say, well, I see that I'm entitled to get this money, but I also see that I'm not entitled to it if it isn't there in the first place. So my bottom line for both those examples is if the state steps up and fully funds, matches, backfills, pick your word, both of those circumstances, then there won't be a negative impact or potentially will not be an impact. If the state does not do that, there will be those negative impacts.
That's a good segue to me. When we thought about dividing this up, we agreed that I would talk about some of the rating agency impacts. You've heard a couple of people speak about the possibility that their ratings would be impacted if the bill were to be enacted. It's worth spending just a minute on that. There's real money involved when it comes to bond ratings. Many local governments get them. It improves the pricing of their bonds. It improves the liquidity, the ease with which investors can sell them. That means a lower borrowing rate is required to sell them. That turns into lower debt service costs for the public body. So a strong bond rating translates into lower borrowing costs. The flip side is also true, that the weaker the rating or a lack of a rating makes it that much harder. They pay more in interest in order to sell the bonds. It is a worthy policy pursuit to achieve strong bond ratings. It's worth real money. Rating agencies look at a number of ratios, conditions, factors in deciding what an individual bond rating should be. Valuations are critical when the pledge of repayment comes from taxes. They know local governments in Iowa have relatively few opportunities to raise revenues. They know property tax is a significant portion of the revenue stream for local governments. So that won't be lost on them. The House bill would make a significant structural change in the tax base. It essentially is similar in many respects to the type of change that occurred when M&E was phased out of the tax base. That's a big shift in policy. You've heard a number of instances where the individual impact of the legislation was described. I won't continue with that. There is an effort in the bill to provide some kind of replacement. That was a big part of the M&E phase out. The language in the current version is a little soft. It's not as detailed as what you saw when M&E was phased out. When that was enacted, there was a guarantee and a provision permitting a revaluation in the event that the replacement was not provided. Those things help ensure that there is not an adverse impact resulting from the shift in the tax policy. There is, and the rating agencies obviously will look at any effort to replace the lost revenue. I tend to think they discount things that don't appear to be fairly hardwired and pretty specific and not susceptible of much change or interpretation. They tend to be skeptics as a rule. I guess the takeaway from all this is that if the House bill were enacted in its current form, it is likely to be perceived generally as a negative for rated bond issues. It will put pressure on those who have bond ratings. It's hard to say exactly what that means for individual issuers. I think, as the mayor of Ames pointed out, there's a wide range of circumstances that rated bond issuers would find themselves in. It's possible that some ratings would be cut. It's possible that some may be lower than they would have otherwise been. Those are hard to say. The most you can say is that the larger the revenue shortfall and the fewer the alternatives for making up the loss, and the more certain that that seems, the more likely that there's some kind of adverse result. Beyond that, individual facts and circumstances start to intrude and make a lot of difference. You've all heard the analogy of turning a battleship. Tax policy is a lot like a battleship. It can be turned, but it's not as simple as driving an Audi, something that turns on a dime. When you have structural changes that are not accompanied by replacement revenue sources or mandate relief or fairly stringent and specific means of replacing it, things will pinch. And that's about all that you can say with any confidence. So this is something that the rating agencies will monitor. We have a lot of bond ratings in the state of Iowa. School districts get them, all the major cities get them. Any issuer who enters the market frequently usually decides that they're worth having. So it's a broad universe. It's not all issuers, but it's certainly those where most of Iowans live.